I am told that success has many parents. All I can say is if I and Cheryl and our team can bring success to the Centre for Social Impact, there should be no doubt that David Gonski is, in a real sense, the paternal father of the organisation. It was his vision that saw a role for a centre based at a university which would promote capacity building in not-for-profit organisations, which would support new forms of social enterprise, which would support corporate social responsibility and look at the issues of philanthropy and social investment. It was David's idea, in a real sense, to set up the Centre for Social Impact, CSI, and I'm delighted that he has agreed to be our first interviewee this evening. So now, please welcome Peter Thompson and David Gonski.
Can I start with a quote? Because what we want to do is talk for half an hour around some of these global issues and then open it up to conversation. And as I've said to a few people here tonight, this conversation could literally go the whole night and it would be very interesting and productive. But Danielle Begg put together some wonderful research for tonight. And I just want to pick up one of the quotes that she had in her research, which goes back to a talk David gave late last year. And it says this, it's a paragraph. Referring to a very wealthy and powerful acquaintance of my father's when I asked what that person did, my father inadvertently said, "He's just a businessman." My father was not a prejudiced person, but I think only now do I understand to what he was referring. I think that in my life, the true growth I have felt has come in the last 10 years as my eyes open to what one can achieve in the community, whether it be in medicine, the arts, education, welfare and so on. So let's start with that last 10 years. What's that opened up for you? Because it's a lovely quote.
Well, thank you. Yes, I don't deny I did say that.
Yes, that would have been a great start, wouldn't it? I never said it.
No, I said it. My father, I might say, was a neurosurgeon, and I remember to his dying day, he always used to tell me, "You're doing so well. I don't actually know what you do, but I know you do it well." He was not a man of business, he was a man of science. But in that quote, and I do remember the day he said it, and there are some here who'd know who he said it of, this was a man who made an absolute fortune in Sydney, but he didn't really do very much for his community. Interestingly, before he died, he spent quite a bit of time trying to redress that. Whether he did or not, I suppose history will tell. In the last 10 years, for me, I've come to a point where I felt I didn't have a mortgage, my children were growing up, and it was time that I did something, people say, for me. But in this case, what I really wanted to do was something that I would be proud of. And not being a very, I suppose, person who was prepared to break out and do something completely different, I sort of took a step out of being the director of public companies and so on, to assisting as a director, as a person perhaps more behind the scenes, in not-for-profits and what they do.
And particularly the arts in those days.
The arts was the first, to be honest, the first group that was prepared to take me. I mean, you know, it's interesting, I gave a speech at a directors' conference for women, and I said, you should go into the arts, you should do this, that's the way you can get on boards. And a very intelligent woman stood up and said, "What makes you assume that anybody would want us?" And she was talking not just about women. And it suddenly occurred to me that most of us assume that we are wanted, but actually our particular skills and so on may not be what is needed. The arts felt that I was needed. I think they were the first to realise that you had to go into the community, try and not only get money, but get sympathy, get people who were keen to be involved in it. And of course that had already started well before I woke up to it, but they grabbed me. And the things I got out of the arts were amazing. And I've got to say, and there are many people here who I've known and many who I've worked with for more years than I can care to remember, but basically I think I got more out of that experience than I've got out of any group of business people. And there wasn't $1 that came my way. It was basically learning about things. I mean, I'll never forget, as long as I live, walking with Arthur Boyd at Bundanon, and he said to me, "Do you know that there are 59 shades of green?" Well, I have to be honest, I only knew one shade of green. And I'm not sure I could
like
find...
snowflakes in Scandinavia.
Exactly. But I'm not sure I can find 59 now, but I've got to tell you, I'm trying. And he started in my mind the fact that maybe you should look around. And I was already, 43 years old by the time I met him. Sadly, he was a lot older and I didn't have him for long. But that sort of experience was the joy of the last 10 years.
You were introduced to Arthur Boyd by Kim Santo, is that right?
I was introduced to a lot of things by Kim Santo, including looking outside of one's community. I mean, Kim was somebody who took me from university. Many of you will remember him. And from the start, he said you had to do something outside. And basically we did. But when you're young, you're keen to achieve things. You don't have a lot of time to sort of have a look, and certainly not to look at shades of green.
What are the themes about Kim Santo, who sort of gave you your first summer residency in a law firm and then maintained a friendship with you throughout his life, is that in the 160 or 170 Talking Heads interviews we've done, we noticed that everyone that's had significant achievement has had very significant mentors. So who would you name as, other than Kim Santo?
I think that there were 3 mentors in my career. I have to say they were all men, but that was not a choosing, it just happened. Kim was definitely the first, and I must tell you, I miss him. He's gone now for 2 years, or not 2 years, it's about 18 months, and he was amazing. I mean, he was Chancellor of Sydney University, I was Chancellor of New South Wales Union. I'd imagine history books will say we spoke more than any 2 chancellors of those 2 universities. The second was a man called Fred Street, who I met as an immigrant when he came from South Africa in about the 2nd year of my legal practice. He'd already made his fortune, he came here pretty rich, and what he wanted to do was to give back. It took me many years to learn, but he has been my mentor on basically giving, on how you can get involved. And he's a legend for many of us who've been involved, say, in the opera. He buses kids from the West to the opera. He's done it for years. He donated the Bundanon place that Glenn Murcutt built. I was just lucky enough to ask him to do it. And the third, I suppose, in business was Frank Lowy. And Frank taught me a lot about business. I was a very sheltered lawyer who needed quite a lot to learn on the fact that, how to push and basically get to an end result. I was much more academic when I met Frank, and I think he dusted that down very well. And I'm now using many of those techniques, I hope, for a general good as well, because you can't just leave your deal doing away from when you leave and go to not-for-profits as well.
What about your parents? Your father's a neurosurgeon. You spent your first 7 years in South Africa. He's Polish by origin.
He is, or was.
And your mother's a relationship counsellor. Interesting combination.
It is. It was quite a quiet family, actually. My father was a very hard-working brain surgeon. In those days, they didn't have the mobile phone. Every time I used my mobile phone, I think how useful it would have been to him. We lived about 25 minutes from his hospital. The phone would ring, he'd be gone, and I don't know what the hospital did for the 25 minutes that he made his way out to what was the University Hospital, New South Wales University Hospital. And but he taught me great professionalism. He was one of these doctors that really I wouldn't have made a cent, really. For him, it was saving lives. And there were many, many people whose lives he saved, some of whom he said to me were worth saving. But one of the ones I've got to say that did start my love for the arts was Yehudi Menuhin. He didn't save his life, but Yehudi Menuhin, and for those of you who know anything about Yehudi Menuhin, broke down at a violin concert he was giving. His back went, and my father operated on him straight away.
That was a good save.
The violin was next to him, and Yehudi continued to be a friend of his till Yehudi died, and subsequently my father died. So my father taught me professionalism. My mother taught me really not to believe in most of the gusto that I come up with. She was a much calmer person, and I think they were a good team.
Now, there have been the odd bump. Westfield Capital Corporation, for example, which was in 88, 89.
No, it didn't last till 88. It was more 87, 88.
So you were managing director?
I was.
Right, and the company went down with substantial debts. And you look back on that now as a learning experience. Just
I do.
explore that.
I should correct the record. It didn't go down. It was actually, I would say, if history ever writes well of us, it will be that we were better getting out of Westfield Capital Corporation than we were getting into it. What happened was that Westfield Capital was the equivalent of a private equity fund today. We used to call them cash boxes. We did quite well in the early days, and then we took a dream and a punt, and we bought Channel 10. Channel 10 was not doing too well, and frankly, we didn't fix it. Then, and I've got to say, to the credit of those at Westfield, they paid, I remember it vividly, $150 million, which they didn't have to leave Westfield Capital in a good way, to make sure that every bank was paid back. Now, you could say that was a good thing because Westfield continues today, and it may not have if we had defaulted on our loans. Every bank was repaid. Obviously, the shareholders didn't get as much as they did. I think they got 50 cents back on whatever they had paid. The shares went up pretty high, so if they bought them high, they'd lost quite a bit. But the elegance of the exit, which was, I worked out the structure. The putting in of the 150 million was not my idea and not mine to do. I think we were quite proud of that exit, and I learnt a hell of a lot.
So what did you learn from it?
What did I learn from it? I think I learnt firstly that you shouldn't assume that every business is your expertise. Different people have different expertises. And I think when you come into a business, there are experts in it and you should listen to them, which we didn't do. I think that you should assume that putting money on the table to buy programming or the equivalent in another business doesn't necessarily mean you'll be the winner. And I think the final thing that one's got to be careful of is that Australia's a small country. Sometimes a duopoly works just fine, but a triopoly often doesn't. And there were 3 television stations at each other's throats throughout the period, and there was really only room for 2, and we were the 3rd. So I learnt a lot from that. I think I learnt also that although I am, I hope, a decent chairman and quite a good advisor, I'm not a great entrepreneur.
Let's talk about the global financial crisis for a minute, because I'm sure you've got interesting views on this, David. Actually, I remember being at an event with David last year for ASIC, and before dinner, sort of David warning darkly that things were going to get worse. So you've got this role as chair of ASX, you're involved in many other companies, chair of Coca-Cola, Amatil, etc., etc., etc. Why didn't the business community smell this ahead of time?
Well, firstly, I'm not sure you can say they didn't. I mean, I've got to say that many of us knew it was coming. Most of us, if they're the same as me, misread the depth of it. I mean, I knew life couldn't go on like it was. I didn't realise it would be so quick, and I didn't realise it would be so deep.
So when you say people did foresee it, there was a big movement out of shares, for example, into cash. I mean, is that what you mean?
No, I think there were a lot of movements. Firstly, many of the banks were getting very worried. If you ask or you're interviewing any of the bank chiefs of the time, they were really worried of where this was going. They were watching, for example, General Motors' debt. They knew that some of these car companies were going to fall over. This was one of the first signs. Everybody knew that risk and reward was being mispriced totally. That basically banks were lending money at minuscule margins and the shareholder allegedly was getting all the benefit. Everybody knew that that couldn't go on forever. But the question is, who moves first? And I think that basically while it was available, people took the advantages. I think that there were many who saw it coming, but I think like many things, when it's coming, you think, well, maybe it'll come tomorrow, not today, and then it came.
Next week, the Australian Institute of Actuaries have their biannual conference, and I'm involved in that, and was speaking to one of the speakers ahead of time, and his area is risk management, and he's saying all the models of risk management are completely rendered useless by what's happened. And he believes there's a consensus moving in the direction of what might take its place. What lessons do you see?
Yeah,
coming
can
from
I
this?
just say, I think I know what he's referring to, and I'm not quite sure it's exactly the way you've heard him. I think that most of the risk models that the banks were using are quite fine and will be proven to be fine. What has been worked out and worked wrongly, I think, is the question is whether Basel II and some of these risk ratios, if I may put them that way, that were to apply to banks worldwide may well not be as efficacious as previously thought. And why does one say that? Well, the magnitude of this has been enormous. Interestingly, and some of you may have read it, some of you may never have heard of thing, but I read the book on Gordon Barton, which has just been released, and it's a very good read. Many people I've mentioned it to in my office have never heard of Gordon Barton.
A mixture of business and the sexual, isn't it?
Well, it's got a bit of that, yes, but it also is a complete circle. He starts poor and he dies poor.
Mm.
And when they talk about the late 70s and the credit squeeze that he was in, which caused his demise, it could be written about today. The difference was that it was happening in Australia and not throughout the world. However, because his business was much more localised, because in those days we all were much more localised, he felt it just as heavily as we do today. So it's just an interesting thing. Australians particularly, who are on the island, so to speak, they, I think, have experienced these sort of things pretty heavily in the past, but it hasn't been a world phenomenon all at the same time, other than the Depression.
Do you see a shape emerging yet about the post-order of what will be the main changes in regulation, attitudes to risk and return and the like?
The one thing I have learned is you never make forecasts.
It's all right.
Right? And you remember the old saying, the problem with forecasts is they're about the future. You know, forecasts about the past are pretty easy. But I think that there's a lot of doomsayers that have been talking very, very heavily how bad this is going to be. And I think the doomsayers in the main may well be proved wrong. That doesn't mean that people are not going to suffer, and that's very much what the not-for-profit area is going to have to help in. Doesn't mean that the Main Street, concepts are going to be pretty bad, but I don't know that it's going to be the total gloom that people are talking about.
Let's talk about the not-for-profit area now more specifically. What is the silver lining then that might come from the global financial crisis for the not-for-profit sector?
I think there are 3 or 4. The first thing, and one of the main proponents is here, for years, Daniel Petrie is here tonight, has said to me, why don't people who make lots of money realise they've got to give back and value as part of their life giving? Well, Daniel, I think a lot of people have lost a lot of money, but some of them have realised that just looking after money is not the only thing in their lives. I'm seeing 1 a month of people coming to me and saying, what should I do to make my life more interesting? I've got still enough, but on the other hand, I haven't got the big mega millions I had previously, and I feel I've failed. Maybe I should try another avenue. And I don't really care what the reason is that they want to do it, but it's starting. So the first thing is there is a chance that some may reappraise their lives and certainly think about other avenues that they can basically be involved in rather than just making money. The second thing is, I hope there might be a bit of a breakdown of the barriers that I see in Australia in relation to the business community being there, the not-for-profits being there, the politicians being there, the academics being another place, and you don't really move between them. There are very few, for example, Peter Shergolds, who've moved from one place to another. We need to get more. And I think maybe for the wrong reasons, but it doesn't matter. More might start to do that. They might realise it's safer to have a job not in a bank but at a university. You may earn less, but on the other hand you're going to be there in the long term, or maybe to work in a hospital or whatever. I think the third thing is that the young are realising the importance of education. And education is provided by not-for-profits and will often put in their minds not-for-profit thoughts. I was really distressed at how many of our graduates at the University of New South Wales didn't go on past their BCom and raced into, a bank. Some of them into my own bank. And I just thought it was wrong. Today, they should get a proper grounding. They should enjoy being young and learn some of the philosophy. Now, of course, the jobs are not as available. Many of the employers are encouraging people to take another year off. That's a good thing. People will learn more, will think more. One of the things I think in boom times is you don't have to think. You just follow the herd and it's usually all right. In bad times, thinking is at a premium.
One of the things you've been involved in under the former Prime Minister was the Business Community Partnership Group. And partnership's a word which is used a lot in relation. It comes really to the second point you made. What progress is being made in that regard? And let's relate that to the current financial circumstances, because corporates that are investing in not-for-profits, or that is supporting not-for-profits, are clearly looking for more partnership involvement than before.
I think some good steps were made in the last, say, 6 to 8 years in terms of partnerships. I think the fear of getting into a structure or an arrangement with a not-for-profit was to some extent broken down in the eyes of business. I think business saw it as more important. Today, business see it as perhaps something else, something that might allow them to use some excess capacity, something that might allow them to keep people busy, something that might allow them to do something else that their shareholders will be proud of while they repair some of the profitable side. I don't really care what the reason is, but I think basically that there is some strong thinking on partnerships. And by the way, I can now see the next stage happening, and that is there'll be partnerships with not-for-profit and not-for-profit. And I'm advocating very strongly that if you're in the arts, as I often like to be, to raise money for, say, the opera today is going to be very hard. But if you raise money for the opera in partnership with disabled children, it might be quite easy, or with people who are out of work. And the two go together nicely. The arts can elevate somebody in that position and solve the problem. I don't mean totally solve the problem, but help.
One of the first things you were involved in this sort of expanded role you took on was relating to the Tax Act and prescribed private funds, which opens up the idea of philanthropic giving as a tax deduction. So that, I see that's very heavily invested in these days. There are now, 600 of those?
There's about 700 now.
Of those organisations registered. Why was that crucial?
I think I saw that there were two parts to it. First, there was a need for the rich to be able to reservoir their money, as they do overseas, for the sole purpose of giving money away. And it was almost impossible to do it in Australia before 2001. So I was very keen. I'd helped a wealthy man try and give away 40 million. He was an immigrant, and he got there in the end. We had to go and see the then treasurer to get it approved. It was ridiculous. If people want to do that, they should be encouraged, as they are in America and to some extent in the UK. So we needed to do that. The second prong was to help those who weren't as wealthy to be able to do it out of their pay packets. And that idea, which was brought to me, was not one of my ideas, was basically workplace giving. And I would see that and the pre-PFs, those two things, as the two prongs of something that really could be big, and I think will be as time goes on.
One of the things you advocate is a charities commission. How would that work?
Well, my philosophy, and some may disagree here, is that there are two major parts of not-for-profit life. One is the raising of monies. This they do, by the way, by giving various accounts out, which they seldom have the proper accountants. They are lodged with the Securities Commission, which really doesn't have the rules that apply particularly to a not-for-profit. And that's not their fault. That's the way the laws are. Most not-for-profits are companies limited by guarantee, which is the old company of the 1600s, and basically has got a lot of problems with it. It hasn't been upgraded. So there is need for the first part of charitable giving, and that is the information part, to have it helped. The second part is who gets tax deductible status. How is that managed to make sure that they're worthy of it? At the moment, the Australian Tax Office does it, and does it, I think, as well as they can. But are they really funded to be involved with not-for-profits? That's a question that I think they'd probably say, and that's a matter for them, and that they're not. They're usually seeking to find people who do pay tax, and so on, and should pay tax. My thesis is a commission should put those two together, that they should be there to work out the standards that should apply to not-for-profits, which are raising money for completely different purposes, and have directors who are generally unpaid. And the second thing that they should be there is to work out who should keep this tax-deductible status. At the moment, there are thousands of organisations that have it. Most of them aren't doing anything. And I think if it came together under one group, they could also provide a third thing, and that is to assist, and I would hope that Peter's CSI can help here, some sort of education to help the not-for-profits get through all these things they have to do.
Now I'm going to ask a few more questions and then open it up to everyone else. The Centre for Social Impact, as Peter was saying, it was partly as a result of your vision that it was established. What is your vision on this?
Well, the one thing I found in the work that I started to get involved in 2001 was there was really very little research in Australia in the area. The second thing was everybody was just working as they went, including us, by the way. There were not very many people teaching how to raise monies. There was not very much teaching to the not-for-profits how to run their businesses. It was all assumed to be like a business, or I should raise monies like I do raising monies for a public company. I felt it needed a higher thinking and a higher teaching. And also, I must say, had another idea, which I felt was that once you bring something like that into a university, it'll permeate through the whole university, and then you know what will happen. It'll permeate through universities generally and make people start to think that this is an avenue either for their life, which is fine, or for part of their life, which is also fine.
And finally from me, of the things you've done, and I think of Bundanon, for example, the Bundanon Trust, and maybe the rebuilding of the Belvoir Street Theatre, what has given you most pleasure of the things you've been involved in? Or satisfaction?
Yeah, to be honest, and it's I don't say it because it's ongoing, I think being Chancellor of the University of New South Wales, and if you say, well, why does it give you pleasure? It's a bit pleasure to see 8 cranes on the campus, and we'd like another 4 if we can get that. But
there's plenty surplus ones at the moment.
Well, we're shovel ready for anything. But the fact is, it's not just the cranes. What I get a great joy about, and I do it, is walking around the campus and seeing the young people. And in a very, and this actually links nicely with how you started, in a very, very funny way, and I suppose I'm being personal here, as I walk around the campus and see these young people, I may delude myself a little bit in thinking I'm helping their future. And then for a minute, I feel proud. And it's a wonderful place. And by the way, if anybody wants to walk around with me, I do it regularly. And the interesting thing is, every time I take even people from our council round, as I did the other day, firstly, they've done it very seldomly, and secondly, they feel a bit of the pride I feel. And we come back smiling, which is very rare in these bad times.
I can see it in your face. David, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Always a privilege talking to you.